Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 253 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technological firm that helps clients manage risk across four key areas: sales and sales channels, suppliers, customers, and human capital. You can find out more about the Red Flag Group at its website, www.redflaggroup.com. Today I have back with me one of my favorite guests, who is Loren Steffy. Loren is the former lead business columnist for the Houston Chronicle and is now with a consulting firm. But he wrote an article in this week's Houston Chronicle about reflecting on Enron and its debacle from 10 years later. He talked about how, unfortunately, many of the lessons learned about corporate governance and culture have not been put into place now. And he really had a interesting information or interesting insight, rather, into Valley and his son has. The episode comes in at just over 17 minutes. I hope you'll find it interesting. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you.
So Loren wrote an article this week entitled "A Decade Later, Enron Verdicts Still Resonate" for the Houston Chronicle in the Sunday op-ed page, and it had some really interesting points that, as he said, still resonate today about corporate governance and institutional investors, management, and what is risk. And they're not exactly FCPA related, but they're certainly apply generally, and they're certainly corporate governance related. So I asked Loren if he might be able to talk to us about the article and his recollections of Enron and what it all means today. So Loren, thanks a lot for the article, and maybe that'd be a great place to start. You were here during the heyday of Enron and the fall as well. So what are some of your recollections or reflections?
Well, thanks, Tom. Yeah, it was really obviously one of the biggest stories I covered in my business career, and it actually started. I was still at Bloomberg. I was running the Dallas and Houston bureaus for Bloomberg, and that's when Enron collapsed. And then, of course, I came to the Chronicle and was writing my column before the trial. And I think it was really the trial in many ways was more interesting to me than the failure of the business itself, just because of the way it played out and the fact that there had really never been a trial of that magnitude for a business issue like this, where you saw two senior executives put on trial accused of criminality and that sort of thing. It just played out on a very, very grand scale. And as a columnist, it was a unique opportunity because I was in court, almost every day, writing about events as they unfolded, either on my blog or in my column. And really, nobody had done that from a commentary standpoint before. So it was a very interesting opportunity and obviously very educational to get to see all that stuff unfold firsthand. So.
Well, as a business columnist, you wrote about a wide range of business missteps and failures. Since you were, at least with the Chronicle here in Houston, a large number of them were in the energy industry. You wrote about safety. You wrote about business acumen. You wrote about fraud around Enron. Was there anything about Enron that struck you as different from the corporate governance failure, or would that be consistent with some of the things that you saw and wrote about from, say, safety failures at either BP or the Texas City plant?
Well, one of the things that I really began to appreciate over many years of writing about companies and the way they react to different things and how they react to failure and that sort of thing, I've come to really appreciate the importance of culture much more so than I did. When people used to talk about culture, I always kind of rolled my eyes. I thought it was kind of a boring thing that was really sort of hard to define. And in some ways it is, but that's what makes it so important, because when you look at Enron, it wasn't just the fact that the top guys running the company were crooks, basically. It was that there was a culture at Enron where breaking the rules was not only accepted in many ways, it was actually encouraged. And so you had a lot of people who would normally not have done things that they did, who were basically encouraged to bend the rules, in some cases to break the rules. And there was kind of this slippery slope that a lot of people found themselves on, and I think they kind of ended up looking around and saying, wait a second, you're telling me I committed a crime? I mean, these are not people who necessarily had criminal intent but wound up getting pushed into that, one way or another. And I think that the culture had a lot to do with that. It really came from the top, and the messages that Lay and Skilling reinforced.
One of the things that really struck me about your column was in your penultimate paragraph you wrote, as I wrote at the time, the verdicts against Lay and Skilling were about responsibility. They were a reminder, then and now, what we expect from our leaders of public companies: honesty, transparency, and accountability. Are those some of the things that you believe make culture?
Yeah, I think that you see that companies that operate well, that generally perform well, are companies that do embrace those things, that understand that the importance of honesty and transparency and accountability as they conduct themselves as a public company. I mean, you're talking about corporations that are basically going out and asking the general public to give them money. And in return for that, we do expect something, and that's kind of what we expect from the companies we invest in and from the leaders of those companies.
Unfortunately, as you very well point out in your article, some of those lessons either have been lost or were not learned because we've had some recent corporate failures, or at least corporate missteps, that point to some of the same problems. And in your article, you detail Valiant and Sun Edison. As bad as Valiant is, because it focuses on pharmaceuticals and a company that perhaps is in an industry that people think they care about, healthcare patients. Actually, I found Sun Edison more interesting because of the vehicles they use, which you call yieldcos, to finance their sales, and that seems very suspiciously like what Enron was doing, almost to the letter.
Yeah, and I think, you have to be a little careful here. Enron is sort of in a class by itself when it comes to these things. There was a level of criminality in Enron that is sort of unsurpassed in many ways in corporate America. So, I was always, when I was a columnist and today, I'm always real hesitant to draw a comparison to Enron, but the point that I was making in the piece is that the mindset that you see, which was very much alive in Enron, that is that you can make risk disappear and only reap the rewards. You see that reflected in the models of some of these companies that have now hit the skids, like Valiant and Sun Edison. And you're right. I mean, the Sun Edison yieldcos are basically an adaptation of the off-the-books partnerships that Enron used. There was a little more transparency around them, and in some cases those yieldcos actually were the ones that raised some of the concerns about what Sun Edison was doing. But this structure that, we're going to take part of our business and we're going to put it over here, and we're still going to generate a financial benefit from it, but we're not going to have to worry about the operations. That's something that very much is still alive and well. Companies are still looking for ways to do that, to be able to capture reward without shouldering the risk. And I don't think it's possible in business. I think that, that's the whole point of capitalism, is that you have to have the risk in order to get the reward.
Well, and maybe the point I drew from the piece was the companies that have spectacular growth, spectacular profits, or spectacular something. It could be because they've got a new idea. It could be because they were first to develop something. It could be because they're doing it better. But it also could be because they're really bending the rules. And Valiant and Sun Edison, the examples you used, pointed me towards what I've really come to understand, that when investors see those types of huge profits, it's because there's a huge risk, but it may also be because someone is really either fiddling with the books or doing something that's pushing you too close to that line. And once you get close to that, the market will react and you will be punished financially.
Yeah, well, I mean, the risk never really disappears, right? So if they're making it look as if it disappeared, that it's still lurking out there somewhere. And it's, as I said in the piece, it's going to come back with a vengeance. And that was kind of what we learned with Enron, and it's what you see with a lot of these other companies. When you talk about, the sort of the Wall Street darlings and stuff, there's a difference between the companies that have a genuine innovation or new product or a new way of doing things, and those that are trying to come up with a different way to account for things that were already done. And, in Valiant's case, for example, they weren't bringing any innovation to the marketplace. In fact, they were doing the opposite. They said, we're tired of taking the risk on trying to develop all these new drugs. We'll just go out buy companies that have already shouldered that risk and then find a way to squeeze money out of them so that we can basically reap the reward, again, without taking the risk. And that should be a red flag. I mean, there's no way that the company could justify the results it was getting when using the business model that it was doing. It really wasn't bringing anything new to the table except for a different type of financial engineering.
I think you may have given me the touchline for this podcast, a different way to account for things that have already been done.
Well, it's really true, and that was very much Enron's thing. If you remember, Enron claimed that they had a different way, a new business model. It was the new paradigm, the new economy, all these buzzwords that we used to hear around the turn of the century. And it turned out to really not have any substance to it. There was no new economy. The same economic rules applied. And just because you had a different way of accounting, or you decided that profits didn't matter, or whatever, didn't change the fundamental rules. And a lot of those companies, including Enron, learned that the hard way.
And I still recall the point-to-point accounting, and how they used what was approved as an accounting standard to really the nth degree, and that led to really the destruction of the company.
Well, fundamentally, Enron looked at accounting rules as something to be gotten around. They looked at the rules and they said, okay, well, it's keeping us from doing what we want to do. How can we get around them and still make it look like we're complying with them? Whereas, really getting back to this issue of, honesty, transparency, and accountability, you want a company that you invest in to understand that those rules exist for a reason. And rather than trying to figure out what they can get away with, they ought to be making sure that they're complying with the intent of the rules instead of, parsing the language of the laws to see what they can get around.
Loren, this has been a great and fascinating conversation. Once again, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to not only visit with me, but to write this article, because people still need to recall Enron and the lessons. And, I mean, we're still living with the outcomes today in the form of Sarbanes-Oxley and continued prosecutions, or at least companies that are bending those rules. Any thoughts on where we might be today?
Well, I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, you're still seeing the fallout from this. The 2008 financial crisis, the off-the-books partnership model was used by Citigroup and other big banks. We found that came out. And, Citigroup was one of Enron's biggest bankers. They looked at what the company was doing, and they sort of said, oh, well, sure, it collapsed into bankruptcy, but their ideas were good, and they took these financial structures and they tried to replicate them. And so a lot of what we're dealing with the Dodd-Frank laws, for example, are still getting at issues that Enron should have already taught us we don't need to be doing in the business world. So I think that it is, unfortunately, human nature being what it is, we're going to continue to deal with this in different forms probably forever.
And when people ask me why are there still FCPA violations, I say because human beings are involved, and I think you hit it on the head. It's human nature to push the rules, change the rules, try to make the rules so that you can gain them. So lessons still to be learned.
Absolutely.
Loren, once again, thanks a lot for taking the time to visit with us. I did want to ask on the at the end of the article when it listed your contact information, it also said you're working on a biography of George Mitchell. Has that come to fruition for you?
Well, it is in the process of reaching fruition. I'm facing a deadline here pretty soon, so yes, I hope that it will achieve fruition soon. But it'll probably be next year before the book's out. But I'm very excited about it. It's a really fascinating story. He was an incredibly interesting man who had a broad range of interests, which even many people in Houston aren't fully aware of. So it's a really, really interesting story, and I'm really excited for the book to come out.
Loren, if anyone wanted to follow up with you about what we talked about on the podcast, could they email you? And if so, how might they do it?
Absolutely. My email is pretty simple. It's Loren@lorensteffy.com. So it's not hard to forget.
Well, Loren, thanks a lot, and I look forward to your next column in the Chronicle and the George Mitchell biography.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom.
All right.
Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to thank you again for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please email them to me as I'm developing my next mailbag episode. Also, if you could rate this podcast in iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to visiting with you again.